Chapter 1 Part 2, Hello, leave me alone. She clenched her fists to keep herself in check. It wouldn't do to get emotional. He would only make a note in her file. It did happen. Just like everything else I've ever told you. Except for the cavorting with demons, the abduction by little green men, and the Elvis sighting. Mary told Mr. Landa outrageous things because he insisted she tell him something. She'd tried to tell him the truth at first, but like now, he always refused to believe her. She wished she hadn't tried to tell him something truthful now. He waved away the disagreement. It's long in the past now. We should focus on this school year. Don't antagonize the other students. Don't talk back to the teachers. Don't cause trouble. She stared at a spot over his head and gave him a clipped nod. She just wanted to get out of there. Okay, we'll talk more next week. Go and get a pass from Mrs. Higgins. I'll see you next Wednesday during third period, okay? He pushed himself to his feet and moved to leave his desk but tripped hard over a side drawer that had slid open. He banged his leg and had to grab the desk to stop himself from belly flopping to the floor. His face went maroon. She knew he was biting his tongue to not curse. Mrs. Brown didn't like it either that Mr. Landa didn't believe Mary. Mary stood up with an unrepentant cheery smile. Mary, hang in there. High school isn't forever. It won't always be like this. She knew what Mrs. Brown said was right on one level, but she was wrong on another. She would always hear ghosts and that meant she would always be different. With a vague wave to Mrs. Brown, though Mr. Landa thought it was for him and nodded goodbye while nursing his bruised shin, she exited the office. She weighed the pros and cons of skipping school next Wednesday. If she skipped, no meeting with Mr. Landa. On the con side, she would possibly get written up for ditching, and Mr. Landa would reschedule and lecture her on skipping school. The pro side still edged out the con side. Mrs. Higgins was busy with a student. Mary leaned against the wall to wait. She needed a pass if she didn't want to get into trouble when she returned to second period. From her vantage point, she saw that Mrs. Higgins was showing the male student a map of the school. Mrs. Higgins' voice droned like an old automated message. All even-numbered rooms are on the first floor, and all odd-numbered rooms are on the second floor. Stairways are here and here. Any room with a letter connected to it is in the gym wing. Mary crossed her arms and tapped her foot. Mrs. Higgins didn't even glance at her to acknowledge her presence. She really wished she had some forged hall passes. As she waited, she scanned the new guy to identify his destined clique. He had on a loose pair of jeans, a pair of scruffy Nikes, and a faded green t-shirt. Surprisingly, the ratty baseball cap required for all teenage boys was absent. He had wavy dark blonde hair. The absence of hat, nice hair, and all right looks tipped the scales to shiny person. Shiny people were the in crowd. They were always happy, got the car for their 16th birthday, had girlfriends or boyfriends, always got invited to the party, and were the people everyone else wanted to be or date. The exact opposite of Mary. The guy glanced over his shoulder at Mary to give her a rueful smile. Mary was flustered by being caught staring and dropped her eyes to the floor. When Mary peeked up at the guy through her lashes, his smile had changed to a good-humored grin. Mary's mouth twitched in response, but she pressed her lips together to keep from smiling back. Mrs. Higgins snapped her fingers to get the guy's attention back on the map. Mr. Landa came wandering out of his office with an empty coffee mug dangling from his fingers. He stopped when he saw the new guy. Then he looked at Mary. She could see the wheels turning in his head. He was plotting something and that was never good for her. He moved over to stand beside her and waited for Mrs. Higgins to finish with the new guy. She tried to edge away, but he dropped his free hand onto her shoulder to keep her from leaving. While the secretary wrote the guy a pass, Mr. Landa stepped forward and dragged her with him. "Are you a new student?" he asked. The guy nodded. Mr. Landa let go of Mary to extend his hand for a shake. He pumped the guy's hand like a used car salesman. She began edging away again. Welcome to Eastern Snyder High, I'm Mr. Landa, one of the guidance counselors. I'm here if you ever need to talk. Hi, I'm Cyrus Asher, new student, said the guy. If you think you're balanced, he'll convince you, you're not, muttered Mary. The new guy glanced at her in surprise, and then shot her a grin. Mr. Landa heard her too and grabbed her shoulder again to pull her back into the impromptu group. I know it's sort of hard to find your way around a new place. Mary, why don't you show Cyrus where his class is? Do I have to? He chuckled and shook her shoulder. It was a little harder than good-naturedly. Now Mary, I know you're eager to get back to class, but surely, you can spare 5 seconds to show Cyrus to his classroom. She wanted to argue, but she had the definite suspicion that Mr. Landa would not let go of her shoulder unless she agreed. In fact, if she refused, he could very well drag her back into his office, so they could talk more. Sure, it's no trouble. Mary, what class are you going to? Asked Mrs. Higgins. Mr. James' chemistry class, room 36. Out of the corner of her eye, Mary saw the new guy glance over to take a better look at her. She would have told him not to bother. He wouldn't be impressed with what he saw. Her hair was black and couldn't decide to be straight or curly, so settled on being a black nimbus glob on top of her head. Nothing about her could decide to be one way or the other. Her hazel eyes were constantly changing from green to brown, and her body fluctuated from scrawny to plump every few months. She was dressed in her first day of school finest, a pair of ragged jeans, Doc Martens, and an old, torn, black t-shirt. Her wardrobe just screamed dysfunctional youth. It wasn't exactly like she tried to look dysfunctional. It was just stuff from the Gap or Old Navy gave her hives, and she couldn't afford it. Here, Mary. Mrs. Higgins handed her the hall pass. Size going to room 18. Thanks. She pocketed the pass and pulled her book bag onto her shoulder. Cyrus was a strange name for a boy. He was probably named after a rich uncle. She walked out of the office with the guy trailing behind her. Once they were down the hall, she glanced back to see if he were gone. She'd figured he'd ditch her as soon as they were out of the guidance office, but he was still back there. This mildly annoyed her. Didn't he know that she only said sure to get out of there? She wasn't a tour guide. She was the most frightening girl in school that exempted her from showing guys where their rooms were, pep rallies, school dances, and yearbook signings. At her glance, he took a few quick steps to catch up. She slanted her eyes at him. He was not about to speak to her. That was another thing she was exempt from: empty, stupid, hall chatter. He evidently didn't know of all her many exemptions due to her rarefied status. Hey, he said. She quickened her pace. He lengthened his steps to keep up. What year are you? A junior, she muttered. Room 18 was visible at the end of the hall. She increased her pace. I'm a junior too. She smirked at how breathy his voice had become from there, almost jogged down the hall. Fascinating. This is your stop. She wheeled around and jerked her thumb at the door. Thanks. I guess I'll see you around. Yeah, sure, whatever. She was already turning away. Glad that she was rid of the guy. Are you this unfriendly to everybody, or is it just my lucky day? Your lucky day. I'm usually scary, she said as she walked away.